Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, September 28th, 2022. Today is Tuesday, September 6th, 2022, and we are in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 14, starting at verse 24. What's happened before this is Saul has been very foolish as a king. While he's crafty in where he puts his troops, he then doesn't obey God correctly. He offers the sacrifice himself. He doesn't have a priest do it. Samuel told him he'd be there in 7 days to do it. And on the seventh day, Saul starts to lose heart and does it himself instead of wait a couple of more hours. And just as Saul gets finished doing it, Samuel shows up. So Samuel is on time. Samuel tells Saul the curse of God, that he will not be, that his lineage will not be king forever, and that that God is looking for a man after God's own heart. We hear that echo from what King David said about him. And then Samuel goes down to where Jonathan, Saul's son, is garrisoned. And we don't hear a whole lot more about that. But then the next thing we hear from Jonathan, he and his bodyguard, his armor bearer, go down and show themselves to the Philistine garrison. And they've said, if the Philistines invite them up, that's the sign that God's going to hand the garrison into their hands. And so they go down the center of the valley, and the Philistines invite them up. So they get to come up the cliff of the valley unhindered, unencumbered, and they attack when they get to the top. And Scripture says that Jonathan knocked them down, and the armor bearer would kill them. And so they took advantage of the weakness of the armor the Philistines had, that it was heavy and encumbered them, particularly if they were down on the ground. And Jonathan would knock them down, and the armor bearer would kill them. And they killed 20 men in the space of about half an acre. And that started a rout, because then God put terror in the heart of the Philistines. And they ran, and everybody then came back to the side of Saul. People that had deserted the army and gone into hiding, people that had deserted the Israelites and gone and served the Philistines because they were the wealthy and strong, and everybody then ganged up on the Philistines, and even the Philistines were fighting themselves. Again, the problem with a confederation is you don't have necessarily unity, and there was divisions between the Philistines, and then once fighting started, people were mad at each other, and God used all that to bring a victory to Israel that day. We're going to hear the second half of the story, though, because, again, Saul is a fool. And starting in verse 24. Now the men of Israel were in distress that day, because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. Now, that is a very foolish vow. Why would you have your troops, between when they're doing hard physical labor of hand-to-hand combat, running, chasing, striking, throwing, shooting, defending themselves, have them weak with hunger, famished? No, you feed them. You want them full. You don't want them groggy full. You want them to just have a meal. But, you want them to be able to fight well. This is the same height of foolish decision as Japheth did when he promised God, if you give me victory on the battlefield, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. Now, um, animals don't just wander out of the house. It's people that come out to you to greet you. So that's a foolish vow. And we've gone over that when we went through Judges. This is the same kind of foolishness. Vowing that you're not going to eat while you're doing physical labor. It'll be afterwards. Yeah, you're winning this battle because God is causing you to win it. But you're not being as vigorous as you could be. And again, Saul was the foolish thing that caused it to be that way. Verse 25, the entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went to the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath, so he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes were brightened. When one of the soldiers told him, your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, cursed be any man who eats food today. That is why the men are faint. Jonathan said, my father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey? How much better would it have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies? Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? Jonathan makes sense. Jonathan realizes that his father has been foolish. And he argues against it. He didn't know it. And he was hungry, and hey, there's honey there in the woods. It's on the ground. He takes his end of his spear and picks it up and eats it. He's taking advantage of free food that's right there. God provided it. Now, it's even a whole beehive is not going to feed the whole army. But those who are famished, it would make them a little better off for a little while. And they could pursue better. And Jonathan is one of those. I mean, he's been too busy fighting to eat. And he started with killing 20 men. Now he's commanding troops, and he's leading them through the woods, and they find it, and he doesn't know his father's been foolish, and tells them. And so he eats, and he's strengthened. And then somebody tells him, hey, your dad told us not to do that. And Jonathan just says what's in his mind. He made trouble for Israel today. Verse 31. That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. When someone said to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. Because they're so hungry, basically what they're doing is instead of cutting the animal's throat and letting it bleed out, they're just killing it by whatever means and eating the flesh raw, not letting it bleed out, not waiting for it to cook. That's what the scene is describing. The troops are way too famished. If they're doing that, and they know better, it's not like they don't know the law of Moses and they're supposed to believe it. That's one of the things that distinguishes the Israelites from the other people in the land. Some of the other people in the land strangle their animals and leave the blood in the flesh and eat it that way. They cut the throat and slit the throat and let the blood out. Now, it doesn't take but a minute or two more. It was perfectly okay, according to the Mosaic law, to eat raw meat. They didn't have any direct objection to it, and if you were hungry enough, you did so. That wasn't the problem. They weren't taking the, 15, 30 seconds, 2 minutes to drain the blood out of the animal, and then they could eat it. They just pounced on it and, heard people say they immediately started just cutting them up live, and that probably wasn't true. They were probably, you know, using their weapons of war that had killed men to kill the animals. Um, Killing them much the same way that you'd kill an enemy soldier. And then eating it. And yes, they're being foolish, but they're that famished, that hurt, and Saul's oath to them that ruinous, that they're breaking the law because they're that famished. Anyway, somebody tells Saul that. So, middle of verse 33. You have broken faith, he said. Roll out a large stone over here at once. Then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So he's brought out a rock. He's going to slaughter the animal there, drain the blood, and then they can take their carcass and go eat. He's having them obey God. Now, he wouldn't have had to give that command if they had been able to eat that day, because they would have, as they got plunder, taken it back to camp, had somebody slaughter it correctly, drain the blood, cook it, and bring it back out to them. And the whole army would have been well fed and continuing to fight, instead of, oh, it's sundown, now we can eat, and then they suddenly abandon camp, abandon the war, and go start eating meat with blood in it. And so Saul, with his foolish oath, has caused all kinds of trouble, and he has now caused them to sin against God. God's not going to bless the camp. He tries to avert trouble by saying, hey, at least obey God and come bring them here and let's slaughter them correctly, and then you can eat. And he does that, and people start obeying the Mosaic law. Verse 36, then Saul said, let's go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them to dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive. Do whatever seems best to you, they replied. But the priest said, let us inquire of the Lord here. So Saul asked God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you bring them into Israel's hand? But God did not answer him that day. Now, there's lots of reasons why God did not answer Saul. First off, he acted as a priest. He's defied the priesthood. He's acted arrogant. He's put a foolish vow on the people. Why should God answer him? Even when he did inquire the Lord earlier in the day, he didn't wait for the answer, but told the priest, oh, never mind, I'm going anyway, whether God says to or not. So Saul has made wrong decision after wrong decision after wrong decision, foolish decision after foolish decision, and he's at this point, and he wants to do what is militarily sound, go continue to chase them now that they're winning, and win the battle, and keep them from running to their home, in homes, in their protection, their safety, and continue to plunder them and their camp and cause them economic harm as well as military harm. I mean, that sounds like a sound strategy. But the priest says, hey, wait a minute, you've been foolish all day. Let's inquire the Lord and see if the Lord wants you to do that. And so Saul finally listens to the priest and says, okay, do that. But God does not answer the priest. God does not answer Saul. And he's concerned. Why not? I mean, God not talking to you in that day and time. It was a serious problem. Verse 38, Saul therefore said, Come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if it lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. But not, but not one of the men said a word. So again, Saul is being foolish, and he realized somebody sinned. Well, look in the mirror. How many ways have you sinned today? Okay, Jonathan's broke your oath, and you don't know it. All the men know it, and they suspect that may be why God is not answering the priest. But they're not fixing to rat on Jonathan, who won the great victory today. They're not going to put him in your hands for you to kill your own son, because Jonathan was the one that actually led them to do the right things today. He's not the one that was foolish and caused the Israelites to be foolish. He's the one that did what God wanted him to do, and acted as king, and acted as general, and acted as a battle leader, and was aggressive and fought and won. And if he's the reason that God's not answering, then probably it's time to not fight all night. That's foolishness. Let's just stop where we have won. And probably nobody wants to fight all night anyway. It would probably be a foolish decision when you're exhausted. You've just overstuffed yourself because you starved yourself all day, and you've quit fighting, and now your king says, let's go fight again. Probably a bad decision. But Saul wants to find out who sinned, who broke the oath, and so he says, and they must die. The thing is, death was not the right choice for somebody who broke an oath. That's, again, breaking God's law. So Saul is wanting to break the law again because somebody broke an oath. We're learning how very foolish Saul is. Verse 40, Saul then said to the Israelites, you stand over there, and Jonathan and I, my son, will stand over here. Do what seems best to you, the men replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, and the Lord of Israel said, give me the right answer. And Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. So the army was cleared. The army was not the one who offended God. Now, the army could have been, because they were eating meat with blood in it. I mean, that would have been sufficient reason for God to say, nope, y'all shouldn't attack. I'm not going to bless you anymore today. It was sufficient reason for God to say, I'm not going to bless you anymore today, because Saul had been making all kinds of foolish choices all day. Sacrificing the sacrifice when it should have been a priest or a Samuel, etc. I mean, we've gone through the list of the ways Saul is foolish. And Saul has been very foolish today. Verse 42, Saul said, cast the lots between me and Jonathan my son, and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you've done. So Jonathan told him, I merely tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now must I die? Jonathan knows that you don't die because you broke an oath. The correct thing to do if you broke an oath was you go take a sacrifice to the tabernacle and ask for forgiveness, and there's this whole ritual there. And let's face it, Jonathan didn't know he broke his dad's oath when he broke it. He didn't know. It was a foolish oath. And Saul should not have taken that oath for the whole army. If he wanted to fast for all day while he fought, that's okay. fast, but don't subject everybody else to it. And you know, Jonathan admits to the only thing he did that was wrong all day. Thing is, Saul could have been the one selected, and let's list the way Saul disobeyed God all day. You know, he's the one leading people in such a way that they violate the law. He made foolish vows. He consulted God even though he wasn't a priest. And then when he did consult God through the priest, he stopped in the middle and said, no, never mind. I'm not going to pay attention to what you tell me. I'm just going to do it anyway. If you're going to do it anyway, why consult God? You know, go sin on your own. Don't have God tell you yes or no and then do it. You're going to do it whether he tells you yes or no. And this foolish vow, and then that causes the people to eat meat with blood in it instead of correctly draining blood out of the meat. And so there's lots of sin that goes on Saul's side. God is compassionate. And we're going to see one way he's compassionate here in the remaining verses. Verse 45. That's it. Oh, no, excuse me, verse 44. Saul said, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan. But the men said to Saul, should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this day with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. So, Saul finally makes the right decision, not because he's convinced it's the right decision, but just simply because he realizes that the whole army is fixing to be rebellion to him if he doesn't acquiesce and recognize that Jonathan won the victory today, that his own son won the victory. And he sees the force of numbers go against him. He can't find the whole army to defend it and kill his own son. He probably doesn't really want to kill his own son. And so he gives in. There's no entreaty of the Lord to forgive Jonathan. There's no offering a sacrifice on his part, which is what the law would say to do. There's just giving in to the force of numbers. And Saul realizes it's foolish to continue fighting if I don't have the army on my side and they're defending Jonathan and God's not answering, and so he quits and he gives the command for everybody to go back home. And the Philistines go back home, they go back home, and the battle is over. They've won the battle. It's been a good victory. Lots of Philistines killed. They have, and remember how this started. Jonathan attacked an outpost. He's provoking things. And then, he's doing what soldiers are supposed to do, warriors are supposed to do. He's on the attack. He's defending the land. He's not letting the Philistines sit there and guard the border and not let people through. He's making sure that Israelites control the border. And that's how it's going. And so Jonathan provoked it. Jonathan won the victory. Yes, he broke an oath he didn't know had been taken in his name. And God was displeased with that. I think actually God was displeased with Saul and all his choices, and he was trying to point that out. And he was not displeased with Jonathan. If he was displeased with Jonathan, what he was probably displeased with was provoking the fight to start with. But something would have provoked the fight at some point in time. They're sworn enemies. They're very close together. Each of them think they should control the other one. God has promised he's going to be on Israel's side if they obey him. And he's trying to teach them, obey me. And they still haven't learned that lesson. Um, they've asked for a king, and now they've got a king who's a fool. And things aren't any better than when they were everyone doing his own thing, because there was no king in the land. Verse 47, after Saul had asserted rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. So Saul now becomes the king they actually wanted. He starts winning military victories. He turns to defending the borders everywhere. He defends all the enemy kings that he defeats the enemy kings that have been raiding the land and causing economic havoc. He makes the land safe and secure. The people have what they wanted, they think. And Saul is setting up a national government in the process, because it takes it to keep a standing army fighting all the time. And he's beginning to go out. Now, I know that it took a while to achieve all those things. If you are fighting hand-to-hand fights, battles, you don't, in just a few days, go all over the border of Israel, attacking every enemy and winning. Each one of those places that's mentioned is probably a separate spring campaign. So Moab, Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, the Philistines, and the Ammonites. So he spent at least 6 years attacking different countries. And that's if he did it in, defeated them in one spring campaign so they didn't come back again. Probably took actually more than 1 year to defeat them that poorly. So, 20 or 40 years is not an unreasonable length of time to think Saul was in charge. And he's setting up a national government to handle that, to handle the support of the troops and make it so that he can do the job. Verse 49. Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Melchishua. The name of his oldest daughter was Merab, and the younger was Michael. His wife's name was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahinoaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were sons of Abiel. All the days of Saul there was bitter war between the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. So Saul is building up this army. There's a continual fight with the Philistines, and he's continually on the lookout for strong men to be soldiers. And he basically conscripts anybody who's strong and brave. And that's part of how he has victory against everybody around him. But the Philistines are the main fight that he's going to fight. And I'm going to leave it here at the end of chapter 14. And we'll learn more about Saul in chapter 15. Holy Lord, you are the one that protects your people. They are your people, and you are their protector. You are the Lord of hosts. You are the Almighty. You're the one that directs men's hearts. You caused the Philistines to lose because they lost heart and they lost courage and they abandoned hope and abandoned their possessions. You remoralized and re-encouraged the hearts of the Israelites, and they won the victory. It was really not so much of what Jonathan did or didn't do, or what Saul did or didn't do. Because if you were concerned about the letter of the law, you would have had the Israelites destroyed that day for breaking the law, for Saul being priest, for the putting a foolish vow on people, for Jonathan breaking that vow, for the people eating food with blood in it. I mean, your people were immoral and broke the law in multiple ways. Yet you still gave them victory because it is you giving victory because of your purposes. And you wanted the Israelites to be strong and to have their own country so that you could show them your salvation. And so you brought victory anyway. And Lord, forgiving sin and bless us. Have us study your word in Holy Monday at church. If not, I will see you Wednesday at the Bible study. And I can't see you there, I'll see you again here on YouTube. Y'all have a blessed week. This has been your host, Frank Rike.